This is a civilization restoration file from the year 3026. Austria's organ donation rate is 99.98%. Next door, Germany sits at 12%. Same culture, same religion, same medical infrastructure. Only one difference: which way the checkbox is set. We found in the records that in some 21st century nations, 17 people died every day waiting for organ transplants. About 6,000 per year. They didn't die because their disease was untreatable. They died because no organ was available. What confused us more was another set of data. In geographically neighboring nations with identical medical technology, the waiting list barely existed. Organ supply was sufficient. Same technology, same humans, completely different outcomes. We first ruled out differences in wealth, differences in medical capability, differences in culture and religion. In fact, studies showed that nearly every major religion supports or permits organ donation. So what was the difference? The answer left us silent for a long time. The difference was a single default option on a government form. In some countries, citizens had to actively check a box to become an organ donor. This was called opt-in. In others, citizens were donors by default unless they actively requested removal. This was called opt-out. Behavioral economists Kahneman and Tversky named this phenomenon status quo bias in the late 20th century. Humans, in the vast majority of situations, tend to stick with the default and take no action. In 2008, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein used organ donation as the classic example of default design in their book Nudge. The clearest illustration was the contrast between Austria and Germany. These two countries share a language, a culture, and comparable medical standards. Austria used an opt-out system. Donation was the default. Germany used an opt-in system. Donation required active registration. The result: Austria's organ donation consent rate was approximately 99.98%. Germany's was around 12%, 99.98% versus 12%. Same language, same culture. The only variable, whether the box was checked by default or left blank by default. This was not a difference in belief, not a difference in morality. It was the power of inertia. Humans left their organs behind because they were too inert to uncheck a box. The situation in the United States was the same problem wearing a different face. The US used an opt-in system. In the early 21st century, only about 40 to 50% of American adults were registered as organ donors. The transplant waiting list consistently held more than 100,000 people, 17 deaths per day. But behind these numbers was a paradox. When researchers asked Americans, "Would you be willing to donate your organs?" over 90% said yes. More than 9 in 10 people supported donation, but only 4 or 5 in 10 were registered. What was the gap? The form that required active action to fill out. Spain was another data point. In 1979, Spain switched its organ donation system to opt-out. In the decades that followed, Spain steadily became the country with the highest organ donation rate in the world. By the early 21st century, Spain's rate was approximately 49 donors per million population, far exceeding most other nations. It is worth noting that Spain's success wasn't solely because of the legal change. They also improved hospital infrastructure, trained dedicated coordinators, and optimized communication with families. But all these reforms rested on the same foundation: changing the default option. We retrieved the basic data on organ donation. A single organ donor can save up to 8 lives. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, pancreas, small intestine. Each organ can extend the life of someone waiting. Additionally, tissue donation including corneas, skin, and bone can benefit up to 75 people. One person, up to 75 lives impacted. So the question followed. Given that the data was this clear, given that science had long proven the solution, given that Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 partly for nudge theory, why had most countries still not changed that default option? The answer was political inertia. In the United States, changing the donation system faced complex state-level legislation, concerns from religious groups, and a political debate called bodily autonomy. Critics worried, if default meant donor, would families lose meaningful choice? Would doctors work less hard to save patients in order to harvest organs? These concerns blocked a policy change that could have been implemented the same day. France made this change in 2017. Beginning January 1st of that year, France implemented a full opt-out system. After the change, organ donation numbers increased substantially. But France had spent decades in debate before reaching that point. We performed a simple calculation from the archives. If the United States had switched to opt-out in 2000, based on the experiences of Austria and Spain, available organ numbers would likely have increased substantially. Against the baseline of 17 deaths per day, over 20 years, tens of thousands might not have needed to die. They did not die of disease, not poverty, not insufficient technology. They died because of a blank checkbox on a form. Looking back 1,000 years later, the organ donation default option problem may be one of the clearest answer, lowest cost, and most slowly implemented policies in 21st century medical history. The science was clear. The data was clear. The neighboring country examples were clear. The only unclear thing was how many years the human political system needed to complete the act of changing a default.